Welcome, everyone. This is Libby Mucciaroni, Associate Director of Education, Technology, and Member Engagement at the Organic Trade Association. I'm pleased to welcome you to the Organic Center's webinar on maximizing carbon sequestration for organic systems. A couple of housekeeping items before we start the presentation today. This webinar is being recorded. In the next 2 business days, all registrants will receive a follow-up email. Included in that are the PDF slides of the presentation, handouts, and helpful links that we share throughout today's webinar, and a registration link to view today's recording. During registration, we ask that you let our presenters know any questions you had on today's topic. With over 550 registrants and over 30 questions, we're so thankful to have such a diverse and engaged audience today. Some of these questions have been taken into account in both today's panel discussion as well as in preparation for the Q&A session. For any questions or comments that you may have today during the presentations, please share them with us in the questions pane. Our presenters will respond to your questions as time permits during our Q&A discussion today. For any questions not addressed, our staff will follow up within the next week. And finally, if you happen to have any technical issues during the presentation today, please notify us through the questions pane, or you can email me directly. The Organic Center is a nonprofit research and education organization based out of Washington, D.C. They work to conduct and convene credible, evidence-based science on the environmental and health effects of organic food and farming, and to communicate the findings to the public. The Organic Center's work is supported by companies and individuals who desire a sustainable and secure food system that promotes the health of humans and the environment. The Organic Trade Association is a membership-based organization for the organic industry. We ensure that all parts of the organic value chain have a strong voice in government and in our communities. We bring farmers, processors, distributors, retailers, and others together to promote and protect the growing organic sector. OTA represents its members to government on sector needs, market development and promotion, and strong organic standards and regulations. Members also receive the latest information and quick answers on organic regulations and standards in the United States and around the world. We're thrilled to be joined by one of the co-authors of a recent study on carbon sequestration, Dr. Rob Cristal-Ornelas. And Rob, if I pronounced your last name, I meant to ask that beforehand, and I'm sure you can correct me. Rob is a postdoctoral scholar in the Energy Geosciences Division at the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. He received his BA in biology from Boston University and a PhD in ecology and evolution from Rutgers University. In his doctoral research, he specialized in meta-analysis and aggregated data from thousands of articles on invasive species and impacts. At Berkeley Lab, he works with a data repository and focuses on development and adoption of data standards for earth and environmental science. Joining Rob for today's webinar is our moderator, Dr. Amber Saligo, Associate Director of Science Programs at the Organic Center. You can learn more about Amber at the Organic Center's website, organic-center.org, and we'll send that link through to you in the chat box in just a second. And with that, I'll hand the reins over to today's presentation to Amber.
Thanks so much, Libby. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, I can.
Great. Well, I'm really happy to be here and excited to see so many people joining us. Welcome for all of you who are joining us for the first time, and welcome back for those of you who regularly attend our webinars. For all of you regulars, you will know that TOC has recently been presenting webinars on topics like soil health and climate change. And today I will be trying to tie those topics together in sort of an indirect way by talking about carbon sequestration. I will also say that for whatever reason, sequestration is a really hard word for me to say, so just bear with me as I fumble through the vocabulary. But we hear this term, carbon sequestration, as a buzzword that's being tossed around in all kinds of circles these days. Academics are talking about it, farmers are concerned about it, consumers are even aware about it, and policymakers are talking more about it, especially now as the US government is more interested in climate policy. And in today's webinar, we'll be presenting some results to you from recent work that will show which farming practices can maximize carbon sequestration. That's the first one. But first, I'd like to give you a little bit of background on what carbon sequestration is in the context that we are thinking about it and why it matters. Next slide. So carbon sequestration, generally speaking, is the process of removing carbon from the atmosphere and holding it in some sort of liquid or solid state. These days, we're usually talking about carbon sequestration in the context of climate change and soil health. And in these cases, we're really talking about drawing down that carbon from the atmosphere and storing it in the soil. Carbon storage is important because carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas and it contributes to climate change. And right now, we're really focused on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And so that includes reducing the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. Carbon is also a really critical component of soil health. This obviously helps contribute to the success of farming, and I will go a little bit more into detail about that later. But before that, I'd like to talk about carbon and climate change, and what links those two things together is agriculture. It's really important that we think about and that we talk about agriculture when we're also talking about climate change. I feel like sometimes it gets left out of the picture. We think about, driving cars and transportation and flying in planes when we talk about climate change, but we have to consider agriculture too, because at least a third of the world's ice-free land is used for agriculture. And according to the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, up to about 23% of human-caused greenhouse gas emissions comes from agriculture, forestry, and other land use. At the same time, agriculture is also depleting carbon from the soil at a pretty alarming rate, and this rate continues to increase each year. So that means that we're simultaneously increasing greenhouse gas emissions while releasing more carbon from the soil into the atmosphere. And both of these things together directly contribute to climate change and the extreme weather events that are associated with climate change that we're seeing across the globe. Climate change is causing both gradual and extreme changes in weather and conditions. That's things like temperature, rainfall, the frequency and severity of devastating storms. We have really been experiencing that in the US in the past few years especially. And these changes will influence the success of crops either directly by causing stress to the crops themselves during these events like drought and flood or extreme temperatures. And it can also indirectly affect the crops when it influences populations of beneficial insects, and also increasing pests and diseases in response to warmer and wetter conditions. And then when farmers are faced with these big fluctuations and extremes, it can be really challenging, to say the least, to produce reliable crop yields each year. So while the situation may sound dire, I did a really good job of painting a positive picture there. It also means that we have this really great opportunity to help reduce the food system's contribution to climate change by using farming practices that will reduce the greenhouse gas emissions and draw more carbon back into the soil. When the carbon is stored in the soil for a short-term or a long-term period, it doesn't just help mitigate climate change, but it also improves soil health, and this generally will increase crop production for farmers. And the way that this happens is that soil carbon really helps improve soil structure. This helps water flow through the soil instead of pooling on top, which will reduce flooding and erosion. The increased water holding capacity in carbon-rich soil will help protect against drought conditions and water stress for crops. And soil carbon also provides a really important source of nutrients for beneficial soil organisms that are responsible for improving nutrient cycling and the uptake of nutrients for plants. And then finally, that soil diversity will help fight soil-borne diseases. Next slide. Great, thank you. So we know that increasing carbon sequestration has a lot of benefits. The question of the day then is, what can we do to maximize that drawdown and storage of carbon in the soil? We also know that there are lots of farming practices that increase soil carbon. These include longer crop rotations or just crop rotations in general. And if you can incorporate perennial crops into those rotations, that's a bonus. Using cover crops and green manures, reducing tillage, integrating livestock can help, including rotational grazing, and also adding organic matter back into the soil by using soil amendments like compost. So there are lots of options to choose from for practices that can help increase carbon storage. There's also a growing body of science that indicates that organic practices can be more effective at storing carbon in the soil for longer periods of time than non-organic practices. But today we're not going to focus on comparing organic and conventional. Instead, we're going to do something different than what we usually do. And we're going to be looking at we're looking at organic practices against each other to determine which have the largest impacts on carbon sequestration within organic farming systems, with the goal of offering information that can help organic farmers choose which practices will help them meet their environmental goals and their bottom line simultaneously. So to quantify how specific organic soil management techniques can optimize carbon sequestration, the Organic Center collaborated with the University of Maryland to conduct a meta-analysis. So this means that the researchers compile data from a lot of different independent studies to find overall trends in the data. And Rob is going to explain this in more detail later. But what I wanted to highlight is that what this means is this is not a specific study for a specific region on a specific crop. We won't have extension-like recommendations that come out of this. Instead, meta-analyses take information from lots of those smaller studies and put them together to get this big picture view of what the landscape looks like when it comes to soil practices. Meta-analyses don't replace more fine-scale regional studies, but what they can do is allow us to identify these larger patterns, filling gaps that we can't see with some of the smaller studies, and also provide a framework for future research focus areas and needs. These can also be really helpful when there aren't regional or crop-specific studies available, because these kinds of studies can give us a general baseline understanding when regional data aren't available. I will say that the limitations of meta-analyses are that you need a lot of studies that meet specific criteria in order to have enough data points to see significant patterns. And with organic, we're really just starting to get to a place where there are enough data out there to do this. This study was recently published in the journal Agriculture, Ecosystems and Environment, and we are making that link to the paper available to you today, I believe. And the Organic Center has also created a non-technical companion document to go with that publication that will summarize the main findings from that work. You can find that on our resources page, but to make it easier, we will also provide that link for you. Next slide. Great. Before I say anything else, I wanted to give a really big shout out to those who helped fund this work, because we just can't thank you all enough. We are really grateful for the support from Patagonia, Organic India, and everyone who has contributed to the Grow Organic program, which has helped fund this. So with that, to deliver probably the most interesting information in today's webinar, I'm going to pass the mic over to Dr. Rob Crystal Ornelas from the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. And he's going to share with you the best ways to increase carbon sequestration in organic systems.
Thanks so much, Amber and Libby. And really, first, I want to thank you all for attending, for listening in. Really appreciate you all joining up, and very excited to share our work today. So, As Emma and Libby were saying, I'm Rob. I'm a postdoc at the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab out here in Berkeley, California. And the work I'll be sharing today is work that I completed while I was a postdoc in my previous position with Dr. Kate Tully, who's listed on this slide, and one of her former students, Dr. Resham Thapa, back at the University of Maryland on the East Coast. So as part of this collaboration with the Organic Center, we conducted a meta-analysis on soil organic carbon research in organic farming systems. So I'll first give you just a very brief outline of my talk today, which will start out with an overview of some trends in organic farming research. That'll really set the stage for part 2 of my talk. In the second bullet point listed out there, I'll describe the results of our meta-analysis, which was published in March. And lastly, we'll have plenty of time for sure to discuss and have some Q&A. Now, the research I'll be describing today all centers around soil health, which in one definition can be described as the capacity of soil to function as a vital living ecosystem that sustains plants, animals, and humans. And soil health can be measured and quantified in lots of different ways that span the physical, chemical, and biological properties of soil. And organic farmers have implemented many different practices to help boost these different components of soil health. The study today that I'll present on builds off of a related study that Dr. Tully conducted. And so I'll spend just a few minutes going through her results that she worked for this project that she worked on with another one of her former students. And I definitely recommend that you look into this study that I cite at the bottom here from 2019 for all of the details. But essentially, they combed through over 1,000 studies on organic farming and identified 4 what we'll call like best management practices, or BMPs, I'll call them sometimes, cover cropping, organic amendments, crop rotation, and conservation tillage that were studied more often than other best management practices. Dr. Tully also found that, especially during the past 10 years, research on organic farming practices tended to study not just one management practice at a time, but they were combining multiple of these practices. So in recent years, for example, studies taking place on a farm would investigate the impacts of organic amendments and cover crops combined on soil health or yield or something along those lines, rather than just organic amendments alone. From the last finding that I'll show from their work, I'll explain this graph just a little bit before a bunch of different colored bars start to appear on the screen. Along the x-axis, you'll see different soil health metrics ranging from organic carbon, microbial biomass carbon, that's MBC there, and then all the way down to weed pressure at the end. Along the y-axis, you'll see the number of times each metric was reported in the published literature base. Each bar that'll now appear on the screen on the next slide is color-coded according to which best management practice was studied. So for example, a tall orange bar over that first soil organic carbon along the x-axis means that soil organic carbon impacts of organic amendments were studied a lot of times. So let's see what that looks like on the next slide. So what they actually found in their study was overall that soil organic carbon, microbial biomass carbon were in general studied quite a bit. That's because, as you can see, all the different colored bars above both of those metrics that I've highlighted in blue here are generally pretty tall compared to some of the other metrics along the x-axis. Within those groups, if we focus in on soil organic carbon and MBC, you'll see that the orange bar representing organic amendments is highest. So this means that many studies on the effects of organic amendments were conducted looking at these 2 metrics of SOC and MBC. So now, knowing what gets studied most often within the organic farming literature, I sort of joined Kate's team, Kate's lab, and we took the next step and tried to quantify how much on average these frequently used organic farming practices change these 2 frequently studied soil health metrics. And I'm happy to share the results now of our recently published study, which is a meta-analysis on how different best management practices influence soil health within organic farming systems. For those that are unfamiliar with meta-analysis, and Amber did a really excellent job of setting this type of study up, I'll go into a little more detail and quickly illustrate how we conduct this type of analysis with a totally hypothetical example to start, just to illustrate the point. On the left-hand side of the screen, we have 3 different primary studies. You can think of these 3 different paper and pencil icons on the left as 3 different published scientific articles. And these studies, for example, might look at how organic amendments affect soil organic carbon. The numbers I have on the left-hand side indicate that a couple of the studies found that amendments increase soil organic carbon by 5 and 10%. Again, totally hypothetical for now, but this is the type of work that we would do in a meta-analysis. And then there was one study, for example, that found no effect, which is that 0 next to the bottom study there. Now, the meta-analysis is where we sort of step in and synthesize the existing published literature. From this, again, hypothetical example, we would take an average of all those numbers on the left side of the screen and find an average effect of about 5% increase from these 3 primary articles or primary studies. And this type of research is important for the many reasons that Amber pointed out earlier. And it's useful to find these sort of general trends that might not be observed or captured in a single study. So Kate's work that I described in the first half of my talk today highlighted 4 widely promoted and really important for us in the meta-analysis world, widely studied best management practices to improve soil health on organic farms. Farmers need to balance the cost, feasibility, and potential outcomes from using these best management practices to determine which they're going to implement on their farms. So our study really builds directly on that work that I presented in part 1 that identified trends in organic farming research. And now we want to quantify and get an average of how much these different best management practices change soil health metrics relative to each other. As you'll notice here, we have these broad categories of farming practices, for example, organic amendments, cover crops, and different forms of conservation tillage. This approach of creating somewhat broad categories is really common and quite necessary for identifying general trends that I'll show you from our meta-analysis. Of course, this means that some of the nuance of each individual article might be lost when we synthesize them all together and do this type of grouping. So I just want to highlight how complementary the smaller scale, like farm scale studies are to our global syntheses. Today, I'll focus on soil organic carbon and microbial biomass carbon due to their influence on chemical, physical, and biological soil health properties. And as we've mentioned now, for us to do a meta-analysis or these type of syntheses, we need to analyze already existing data from other published studies. And from Kate's earlier work, we learned that these were studied most often. And there's been quite an increase in the number of meta-analyses that actually are appearing within the agricultural research in the past decade. As you can see from the examples that I have on my slide here, they typically compare organic farms to conventional farms or organic practices to conventional. Because this is their typical study design, it's been challenging to investigate the relative importance of adopting specific best management practices within organic farming. So the motivation for our work was the need for a more comprehensive meta-analysis in which several best management practices are simultaneously evaluated to assess how they can improve soil health metrics relative to each other. The studies that are included in our meta-analysis generally look something like this. I just wanted to illustrate one more time before we sort of dive into the results. They'll include one farm plot with, for example, cover crops, crop rotation, and then another plot which have the same cover crop, same crop rotation schedule, but this time they add in organic amendments. And we asked how significantly did that addition of organic amendments increase or decrease soil organic carbon, or MBC. Then, for the purpose of the meta-analysis, we found similar studies. So here we'd find scientific paper number 2 that had a similar experimental design and average the findings across both of them to get the average increase or decrease in SOC or MBC. And in meta-analysis, the goal really is to aggregate data from like studies. The figures and results I'll show next are from this recently published meta-analysis that we have the link to make available for you all. It's free to download, openly available until April 20th using the link we have for you. After that, I'm happy to email copies, after that date. So yeah, please feel free to get in touch if you'd like access after the 20th. And I'm also happy to follow up over email regarding the details of our methods, but I do want to highlight that a key part of the methods was locating all of the articles we could find that studied how best management practices perform compared to more organic control plots. We searched for published studies and started with a pool of candidate studies that numbered over several thousand potential scientific articles. The diagram here shows how we took these different steps of reading all the titles, seeing which ones would be relevant for our meta-analysis, all the abstracts, and eventually the entire published studies before we ultimately identified 33 studies that measured organic BMPs, best management practices, influence on SOC, and 7 that measured how these BMPs influence microbial biomass carbon. I also want to highlight that although our literature search for studies was global, all the studies that we included in our meta-analysis, or that sort of met the criteria for inclusion in our study, took place in the Northern Hemisphere. I'll now go through the main results of our study, and first I'll orient you to this type of figure called a forest plot, which is typical of any meta-analysis you'll read. Along the left-hand side of the screen, you see the 3 BMPs for which we found enough data and published studies to analyze in our meta-analysis. The red line down the middle is the line of no effect. In a moment, you'll see horizontal lines appear on the screen, and if those lines cross that red dotted line of no effect, it means that on average, the best management practice did not have a significant effect on soil organic carbon. Lastly, I'll show the percent change on the right-hand side of the screen, either increase or decrease for SOC. Okay, so now I'll go through, I'll walk us through the results here. Now that the horizontal lines have appeared, we see that on average, the biggest increase in soil organic carbon was from organic amendments, followed by conservation tillage. Because the horizontal line for cover crops crosses the vertical line, it's no longer red in this image of the figure. That means the increase of 15% was not statistically significant. We then asked whether SOC tended to increase at shallower soil depths or at greater depths. What we see here is that in the top forest plot, is that for organic amendments, SOC significantly increased at both the shallow depths and the greater depths. Conservation tillage similarly shows that on average increases were statistically significant across both of those different soil depths. Now, when we look at cover crops, you'll remember that in the very first forest plot I showed you, there was a non-significant effect of cover crops on SOC. But when we take this more nuanced look at how soil organic carbon changes depending on soil depth with cover crops, we see that there was a significant increase in SOC over that shallow soil horizon, soil profile of 0 to 15 centimeters. Next, we took these same 3 best management practices and investigated changes in soil organic carbon over time. Along the x-axis, we have the time that different farms were under organic management in the number of years they were under different organic management. And on the y-axis is one of the statistics we use for meta-analysis, which we can mostly ignore that statistics, the details of that for now. But generally with this figure, when those dots are above the dashed horizontal line, it means that particular best management practice increased SOC. When the dots are below, it means that the BMP decreased SOC. So if we first focus in on that gold horizontal line, which represents the effect of organic amendments on soil organic carbon, we notice that the line that best fits all of the gold data points in this graph is consistently above the dashed line, meaning that on average, organic amendments significantly increased SOC over the short and the long time spans. Interestingly, you see that for the shorter duration cover cropping systems, there was not a significant effect of SOC. Those points are all sort of below or right on that dashed line. Only when we cross the 4 or 5 year mark do cover crops start having an average positive impact on SOC. The last result I'll show today from our meta-analysis is related to microbial biomass carbon changes. When we aggregated together data on best management practices and MBC, we found an average increase in of about 30% in microbial biomass carbon with these different organic farming practices. Now, because we only found a handful of studies, around 7 studies, on how BMPs improve microbial biomass carbon relative to other farming practices, we weren't able to conduct those sub-analyses related to changes in MBC over different soil depths, or different time spans. But we identify these as an important meta-analysis to conduct once there's more research published on the topic. And to close out my presentation, I want to highlight a few key take-home messages. We found that when averaged together, best management practices led to an increase in SOC of 18%, and even higher for some of the specific practices like adding organic amendments or something to that effect, and an increase of MBC on average of about 30%. For some of those best management practices, the increases, particularly when we looked at soil organic carbon, were seen over longer time spans and at shallower soil depths. Some areas of research that remain to be investigated related to our work could look at stacked practices. For example, what are the average impacts on soil health when organic amendments are combined with cover crops? We just didn't find enough research on these practices that were sort of amenable to how we conduct the meta-analysis statistically. And lastly, when more research on, for example, crop rotation or biochar is published, these will make for interesting topics of meta-analyses, particularly as these practices relate to changes in different soil health metrics over time or at different soil depths.
Great, thanks so much, Rob. Did you have anything else you wanted to add there at the end, or are we good to go? Or have we lost you at the moment? It looks like we may have lost Rob for a second. I think that he might be frozen. And I know this is wrapping him up, so I will send his contact information out in just a moment. Amber, do you want to jump on with me in just a second here? I'm going to do one quick thing. Hi, thank you, Amber.
Sure, hi.
So what I will say here, as Amber is joining on camera and as we work to get Rob coming back on, I'm sure he's going to need to grab a drink as well. He's done such a fantastic job giving us some information. We'd like to, again, just highlight all of the sponsors from Grow Organic Research that really helped to make this research that we're talking about today possible. For the organic industry to continue to thrive, we need companies like yours to assume leadership roles to advance organic research, such as today's discussion on soil health and carbon sequestration. If you are interested in more information or to discuss ways that your business can continue to help us all grow organic, please contact the Director of Industry Relations at the Organic Trade Association, Cassandra Christine. Rob, I'm going to see, have you made it back on with us? Let me double check one quick thing. Give us just a second. Yeah, it looks like we've lost Rob for the moment, which is ironic. We were talking about technical issues and how we wouldn't run into any, and then we ran into technical issues. I'm sure Rob will be joining us in just a moment. Amber, while we're waiting for Rob for a second here, I'm going to actually talk very quickly about the benefit dinner, if that sounds good to you.
Oh, that's great.
Great. So on Thursday, May 26th at 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Pacific, during the Natural Products Expo West, organic industry leaders and consumers will come together for a virtual event to celebrate the incredible science behind organic. The celebration will feature inspiring keynote speeches, informative research updates, and organic recipe tutorials with influencer watch parties, raffle prizes, and ways to support, sponsor companies, and engage in the work of the Organic Center. More information about the event will be announced on April 26th, so please stay tuned to your email next week from the Organic Center directly for more information. And the other thing I will quickly note as well, throughout the year, the Organic Center provides relevant organic science education, and it's open to all who are interested. We're pleased to announce that this summer we have 2 new webinars on July 15th and July 23rd, where the Organic Center will invite you to join us for these webinars. And they're presented by the UC Davis and the Produce Safety Alliance on best practices for using compost and manure to enhance soil health and mitigate food safety risks. You can register at the links shared in the chat box, or you can find more information at organiccenter.org/events, and I will send all of those links through in a second. And you can also find other on-demand education from the Organic Trade Association and the Organic Center there. Rob, I'm going to check and see if you've managed to dial in and join us. Okay, so while I work to find Rob here in just a second, Amber, I'm going to pitch a question to you here in just a second. I'm going to take this slide down. We received, so many questions from this. So my first question is going to be specific recommendations on specific soil amendments that you can talk about. They were talking about like different contexts, and a lot of the questions are really actually outside of the scope of the study. And we've attached some handouts that you can see. There are 3 different handouts today to give you more resources. But I would like to note that with that handout, we've also included a link to the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service, and that'll really help you find all of the local experts in your region specifically. Those are the best people to reach out to, and they really will be able to help with context-dependent questions to your specific region and growing conditions. So noting that, I will ask our first question of you, Amber, and it relates to some of the work at the Organic Center. A registrant asked, how does organic fiber production fit into the story of climate-smart agriculture, and how can brands and consumers find accurate information about organic apparel?
Thanks, Libby. This is a really great question. I'm very happy that somebody brought up fiber production because I think a lot of times when we think about organic, we tend to think about organic food crops, but there are really important fiber crops that we grow too that can make a really big positive impact on the environment when we choose organic. And you're right, we did just recently release a report on organic cotton, and it summarizes the literature as well as a recently published study that TOC partnered on with Iowa State University. And in summary, spoiler alert, it basically shows that organic production can use less energy, it can emit fewer greenhouse gases, and since conventional GM cotton production especially can use a lot of chemicals, organic production can really reduce the impacts of chemical use and all those externalities associated with it as well. You can access that report on our website. Today, I think we're making it available to you as a handout, so it's easy to find. But if you do mosey on over to our website, you will also be able to find several blog posts as well as hot science posts. Those are basically just summaries of scientific research. And we have lots of those that are related to organic textiles as well as organic body care. And I think I see that Rob is back on, which is great because I was just thinking to myself, I wondered, Rob, if you were able to find, if you happened upon studies that were related to organic cotton or other fiber crops in your meta-analysis.
Yeah, sorry about my connection issue. Hopefully you all hear me okay. Okay, great. Hi everyone. Sorry about that. But yeah, we didn't constrain, like some meta-analyses will say we're only going to look at crop yields and food production or something like that. We did not constrain our search, and so we did pull in some organic fiber production studies. I don't have off the top of my head the number of how many of our 40 or so looked at that. But we did bring them in, and might be a good subject for its own sort of meta-analysis, just looking at those. Or yeah, that's a nice question, nice idea.
Great, thanks, Rob. So we have a few questions that are related to meta-analyses and how you conduct them. We've received even more during the webinar itself today. So my first question for you that I'll pitch out is, how do you ensure that you don't miss any studies on organic farming practices in your meta-analysis?
Yeah, so the typical approach is to cast a really wide net, I would say. Like, we want to make it, and it takes us sometimes a year or more to even like start sort through all of the studies. So our approach has been search through databases of published research, make sure we're using terms that can capture all of the sort of metrics we're looking for in these published articles, all the different terms that researchers might use to describe their papers, how they title them, and all of that. Cast a really wide net, and then sort from there, getting rid of ones that we deem as sort of like irrelevant. So yeah, it's a long process, and that's basically how we try to get as many relevant studies as possible.
Great, that's super helpful. So should these types of meta-analyses be updated over time? And if so, how much time would it take to repeat your steps?
Okay, well, starting from scratch can take a really long time. As I mentioned, it can take years, but more and more it's becoming common. Like we did for our paper, we published also the data associated with the paper online in an archive that people can get access to. So it'll be really easy for someone to take what we collected and sort of build from there as more studies are conducted. So from scratch, it would take a while, but with this more shift towards open research and open data, it could be a bit easier at least.
Well, there's a benefit to technology in general, right? It may
Yeah.
So another question that we received today was, how were studies of integrated animal crop systems and rotational grazing addressed in your meta-analysis?
Could you repeat that one more time?
Yeah, sure. How were studies of integrated animal crop systems and rotational grazing addressed within the meta-analysis?
Rotational grazing, we didn't have it. I believe that was sort of one of these categories that we didn't have maybe for both of those enough published studies to include them as even like a subgroup. I want to point out like maybe biochar as like another one of these groups that that we just didn't have enough. Like maybe we'd find one or two and include them in the overall average 18% increase in SOC when you do these sort of organic best management practices, but couldn't analyze them in subgroups further.
Okay.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think, in my experience looking for these sorts of studies that are specifically in organic systems, I don't think there are so many papers that are looking at rotational grazing itself. I do know that there's a lot of interest in increasing research in this area. A lot of farmers are interested in sort of returning to the time when we used to integrate livestock more into our farms, but trying to understand, food safety management, as well as what the benefits are for carbon storage. Those are of interest, but not published yet.
Great, thanks for that, guys. So we received a couple different questions about organic amendments. So I'm gonna pitch a couple of these out to you because I think they're important to kind of level somewhat for the rest of our conversation today. So can you elaborate a little bit more on what organic amendments entails? Is it compost, bone meal, something like that? And related, I'm going to add this secondary question. Can you also talk about like the most common organic amendments?
Yeah, I think we would have categorized again with this sort of like grouping approach. Those would have all been nested under organic amendments. That was our approach. And in terms of what the most commonly used one, yeah, that's a good question. I could maybe take a look real quick at our database, but I would have to go into the database to just see which within that category was most commonly used. So sorry, I don't have the answer right away, but yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, that's a good question that, like, taking a look at the database, we could pretty easily figure out though.
Well, surprise on that, last minute addition to the questions, but I think it'll be great to hear some more information from you afterward as well.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to pivot a little bit. Not surprisingly, we've gotten several requests related to tillage. Specifically, people are interested in how conservation tillage is defined, what conditions or soil types the practice is most successful, and how conservation tillage fits into the regenerative organic framework. Can you guys talk about that?
I'm going to let Rob start maybe with the definitions, which could be the easier part, and then maybe I'll tackle the rest.
Yeah, sounds good. So the way we defined conservation tillage for the purposes of our meta-analysis is anything less than, a deep tillage that would represent conventional agriculture. So, for example, we would group like both a no-till approach and conservation tillage approach in this meta-analysis. And again, that's just another example of the grouping as opposed to splitting categories. But one thing I will say is the benefits of conservation tillage, while not as strong as just based on our research, while not as strong as that soil amendment 30% increase, it's still certainly contributed to an increase on its own in SOC, and it can also just sort of like add another layer of boosting soil organic carbon in addition to organic amendments. So that was sort of, I guess, one of the benefits of our approach. By looking at organic amendment in isolation, we sort of can say this is on average how much it was boosting SOC, and then tillage on its own was increasing it by a certain amount as well. So I think it speaks to sort of how they both in their own ways can increase soil organic carbon.
Yeah, I think that was one of the really exciting results that came out of this work, for me at least, because so many people are talking about tillage, and I loved that we were able to see, how much each of these practices contributed. And also it was really interesting to see that tillage didn't seem to have the biggest influence, even though I feel like a lot of people put a lot of weight into that practice itself. So I guess I'll tackle the second part of the question. Part one of part two of the question, I think, was if there are certain conditions or soil types where tillage will have different effects. And I guess I would respond to that by saying that, yes, likely, the practices you're using will have different impacts based on your soil type, on the climate, the region, just the specific context of your farm. And the results from this study are, that's a question that's outside of the scope of the results from this study. So if you have specific questions about your farm or your region, always contact your extension advisor if you can. Also, just coming back to that list of resources that you mentioned at the beginning, Libby, I haven't actually tried to use the NRCS resource that we've given, but something that was really interesting to me about it is that it seems that there's access to actual people from specific regions. So it's like extension type information that's available to you, or people that are available to you. So if you start with your extension advisor, and you can't find, they don't know, you could also check with the NRCS and see if they know. So then the next part, which is which is the fun and tricky part of the question, is talking about regenerative and how, you know, conservation tillage fits into that framework. And I guess I'd like to first start by saying that what we do know is that there is a lot of variation in tillage that's used, both in the amount of tillage, but also the type of tillage that's used. And that's across all systems. That's in non-organic farms and organic farms. There's just this wide variation of tillage that's used. On top of that, there's also a lot of variety in the other types of soil management practices that people use. And so when you combine all of those together and you have all these different combinations, it can be really challenging to make comparisons between one farm and another, or organic versus conventional. But I will say that a little while ago, TOC partnered with Northeastern University to try to do this. And so they took over 1,000 soil samples from farms of all types across the whole US. And they found that despite all of that noise and all of that variation that existed, organic farms came out on top, where they were consistently storing more carbon in the soil than non-organic. And just pointing out that those results included that variation in tillage that exists. So this also brings me to a couple myths that I want to bust. I think we bring this up a lot, and I know I've certainly said this in past webinar Q&As, but they're very common, and I just want to make sure that we address them. So the first is that organic farming uses less conservation tillage than conventional farming. But if you look at data from NASS, which is the National Agricultural Statistics Services, you'll see that there's actually a very similar percentage of farms, both organic and conventional, that use conservation tillage. Additionally, there's a lot of research that's going on right now on organic systems to try to, you know, improve and expand no-till within organic, or at least reducing tillage. The second myth is that organic doesn't sequester carbon because of tillage. And the first thing that I'll say is, well, this webinar and Rob's results show that actually, you know, tillage, that organic can, despite tillage. So it's, you know, the organic amendments make a difference. Tillage is a bonus if you're able to practice less tillage or no-till. But in addition to that, past work has come out of the USDA that's, it was a very extensive study, and it found that even organic with full tillage had more carbon sequestration than conventional no-till. And a lot of that result had to do with sort of the location of the carbon. So in the conventional systems, or the no-till systems, sorry, there was more accumulation of carbon on the top of the soil, which is a little bit more vulnerable to being released, whereas organic with tillage was sort of incorporating that carbon deeper into the soil. And this brings me to the final point of regenerative. And I just wanted to really highlight this point. When we talk about regenerative and how tillage fits into that framework, I want to remind people that farms are whole systems. So there isn't just a single practice that makes a farm regenerative or not. If you're thinking about the ability of a system to foster healthy ecosystems that can build healthy soil, reduce greenhouse gases, you know, draw down that carbon into the soil, then organic is a giant leap towards regenerative, especially when you compare it to the average conventional operation. And this is particularly true when we're thinking about no-till in conventional systems being accomplished by using chemicals, using herbicides, because this chemically disturbs the soil, it chemically disturbs and alters the soil microorganisms that are responsible for making the soil, for building the soil's potential for storing carbon. And then finally, my last point, and something that we also rarely talk about, but it's super important, is that synthetic nitrogen fertilizer that's used in many of the no-till systems, conventional no-till systems, is also a major contributor to greenhouse gases. So again, my main point is that with a systems approach and thinking about this from a system level, organic is climate smart, even when conservation tillage is used. That's a very long answer, and I'm done. Dropping the mic.
It was a very good mic drop. A fantastic one at the end there. So we've gotten a bunch of questions about biochar and whether it was included in the study as an organic amendment or whether it is a climate smart amendment. Rob, did you see anything about using biochar in the literature review for your meta-analysis? I know you briefly referenced it a little bit ago as well, but.
Yeah, we did, and it would fall under like organic amendment for us in that broad category. But I do want to say that we found maybe like only one or two, maybe even just one study that looked at the influence of biochar on these soil health metrics that qualified for our meta-analysis. That's not to say there's not more out there, but you know, for the purposes of the meta-analysis, we could only include one of those. And even in our paper, we do highlight that as biochar specifically as one area that could use more research, more published research, and be sort of like a version 2.0 of this study update included as one of those subgroups. Because I know it's for sure gaining more traction in the published literature base, but as we've been kind of pointing out, you sort of need at least a handful of studies before you can start looking closely at that data and synthesizing it.
Great, thanks, Rob. Amber, did you have anything else to talk about with biochar?
I mean, well, actually, just as Rob was talking, I was wondering if there's maybe more science out there that's related to biochar in the non-organic farming world, because I think biochar is becoming more popular in the organic world only recently. And again, this is one of those more specific questions that it would be great, like, you know, to find out from your extension advisor if you're interested, if they're doing the research, and if they're not, then you could suggest it.
Well, yeah, I think that's, I think it's always valuable to keep pointing back to extension advisors for local research questions. So I appreciate that reminder again, Amber. There are a couple of questions. I know we're wrapping up. I think we've got time for one more question here. There are a couple of questions that we've had that are related to accuracy and feasibility of measuring soil carbon in the field, and it ties in with other questions related to policies. I'm assuming that the idea of outcomes-based incentives or goals for climate-related policies, and I will say we received, you know, over 50 questions, it looks like, just today, and we're obviously not going to have time to tackle all of those, but please do know that we will be in touch with questions that we haven't answered so far today. Some of them, quite a few of them, related back to parts of the presentation and Q&A questions today, but I'll stop talking there and let you go, Amber. Thanks.
Yeah, you know, I think that what these questions are trying to get at is this point that to do soil testing, it's pretty expensive. A lot of times labs are limited. And more affordable testing, there's a concern that it might not be as accurate. We've also been hearing sort of some chatter about concern from farmers that they will be expected to flip the bill for this kind of testing when they're also asked to meet certain carbon sequestration goals. And then what do you do if those tests aren't accurate in the first place? So, and I think that this is all sort of relating to current discussions that are bubbling right now about climate policy that's considering using outcomes-based models. And this is a really good question because it brings up an important challenge that these models can have. So beyond even the feasibility and the accuracy of the soil testing, we've also mentioned multiple times that, you know, what happens in the field is context dependent. And so it's hard to know how much one practice might raise the bar, you know, in one area versus another. And so we really need to have a lot more regionally based research, I think, to start getting a better understanding of how well these outcomes-based models will work for future incentive programs.
Great, thanks so much, Amber. And I think we're going to wrap it up here. We've got about a minute to go. I want to thank everyone in attendance today on behalf of the staff and the members of the Organic Trade Association and the Organic Center. And many thanks to Rob for joining us today, for fighting through the technology challenges that we experienced midway through. I think it was a really fantastic conversation in the last hour. We really appreciate both of your time and your commitment to organic and for working to prepare for today's webinar. Thanks to all of our Organic Trade Association members in attendance today. If you are not a member of the Organic Trade Association but would like to speak to our membership team, please let us know in the webinar survey after the webinar today, or you can reach out directly to me and I can point you in the right direction. As a reminder, slides, handouts, and a link to register to view the recording will be emailed out to all of you who registered today within the next 2 business days. On behalf of the Organic Trade Association and the Organic Center, we hope you can join us for future educational opportunities. And please have a wonderful day. Thanks so much, Rob and Amber.
Thank you. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.